Imagine a small camp. 11,000 years ago, someone 2 tenths over starts coughing. Nobody knows what a virus is. Nobody knows what a cell is. There's no soap, no medicine, no concept of contagious. 3 weeks later, half the camp is dead. Here's the part that should stop you cold. That happened to your ancestors. Specifically, again and again, for hundreds of thousands of years. Not might have happened over and over. And you exist right now because every single one of your ancestors won that horrifying lottery every time it was played. So the real question isn't how ancient humans survived deadly viruses. The real question is, what did surviving cost them? And what did it leave behind inside you right now without you ever noticing? Stay with me, because this involves cavemen dating Neanderthal, a plague that reshaped Europe's DNA, ancient people snorting smallpox scabs on purpose, and a twist ending involving COVID that nobody saw coming. Let's start with the obvious problem. Ancient humans had zero idea what they were fighting. No microscopes, no germ theory. For most of human history, when people got sick and died, the explanation was spirits, curses, bad air, angry gods. Nobody was identifying single-stranded RNA virus as the culprit, so if the enemy was invisible, unnamed, completely misunderstood, how did humanity not just get wiped out? The first time something like measles or smallpox showed up? Here's the twist. You didn't need to understand the enemy to fight it. Your body was already doing that, automatically, before you were even born. Think of your immune system like a spam filter, trained for millions of years. Except instead of learning from your inbox, it learned from a graveyard. Every virus that tried to wipe out your ancestors and failed left a note behind in their DNA. That note got copied, generation after generation, refined, edited, passed down. By the time it reached you, it wasn't a guess anymore. It was a weapon, shaped by every plague that ever tried to kill your bloodline and lost. So let's talk about the first layer of defense. The one that existed before humans even existed. It's called the innate immune system. Less elite special forces, more loud alarm that shows up to every party uninvited. A virus gets into your body. Certain proteins detect a chemical signature that screams, "This doesn't belong here." That triggers interferon, molecules that interfere with the virus's ability to copy itself. Your temperature rises. That's not a bug. That's a feature. Fever is your body deliberately making itself a worse place for the virus to live. Like turning up the heat to make squatters uncomfortable enough to leave. None of this required knowledge. None of this required doctor. This system is running in you right now. It was running in a human hiding in a cave 60,000 years ago, exactly the same way. But here's a plot twist that reframes the whole question. For most of human existence, the kind of catastrophic virus we're picturing right now couldn't have existed yet. Picture a hunter-gatherer band, 30 or 50 people, moving constantly, rarely bumping into other groups. A virus that only spreads between humans needs a steady supply of new people to infect. Otherwise, it burns through the group, runs out of hosts, kills itself off along with everyone it infected. For something like measles to survive long-term, you need several 100,000 people in ongoing contact. Otherwise, the virus has nowhere left to go. It dies out on its own. For most of human history, we didn't live that way. So, in a strange sense, our ancestors' biggest defense against history's deadliest viruses was this. Those viruses hadn't been invented yet. Then, agriculture happened. Humans settled down, built villages, then towns, then cities, packed more people into smaller spaces than ever before, and right alongside us, we domesticated animals, living in close quarters with cattle, pigs, poultry, day after day, generation after generation. That closeness became a bridge. Measles is now believed to have jumped into humans from a cattle virus called rinderpest. Influenza has jumped from birds and pigs into humans more times than anyone can count. Smallpox likely evolved from a rodent-associated virus long before it became a uniquely human nightmare. The inventions that let humanity grow, stockpile food, build the first cities, those were the same inventions that manufactured epidemic disease in the first place. We didn't just get unlucky, we built the incubator ourselves, then had to evolve fast enough to survive what we'd created. But biology was only half the fight. And this is where it gets interesting, because ancient humans weren't passive. They noticed patterns even without knowing why those patterns existed, and they acted on them. Long before anyone had a word for contagious, people figured out, purely through observation, that sickness traveled from person to person, and that distance between the sick and the healthy somehow helped. During plague outbreaks in medieval Europe, port cities like Venice forced incoming ships to sit offshore. Wait, before anyone could disembark. 30 days at first, later extended to 40. That 40-day wait is where we get the word quarantine, from the Italian 40 giorni. Nobody on those docks understood bacteria or viruses. They just understood from brutal repeated experience that waiting saved lives. That's not medicine. That's pattern recognition under unimaginable pressure, and it worked well enough that we still use a version of it today. Here's a genuinely wild. Ancient humans didn't just avoid disease. Some of them figured out how to deliberately trigger a mild version of one to prevent a deadly one. Centuries before Edward Jenner. Centuries before anyone knew what a virus was. In parts of China as early as the 15th or 16th century, and independently in India and across the Ottoman Empire, people developed a practice called variolation. They'd take material from a smallpox scab, dry it, grind it, blow it into a nostril, or scratch it into the skin. The result, most of the time, was a much milder infection than catching smallpox naturally, and it left the person immune for life. It was risky. Some people still died from it, but across a population, it dramatically cut smallpox deaths. Think about that. Centuries before anyone understood an antigen, before anyone had seen a virus under a microscope, ordinary people had already reverse-engineered the basic concept of a vaccine through trial, error, and desperate observation. When European doctors later discovered inoculation, they were mostly encountering and eventually formalizing a practice that had already been keeping people alive elsewhere for generations. Okay, back to biology. Because your innate immune system isn't just some general-purpose tool you were born with, some of the sharpest parts of it, quite literally, came from someone else. About 50 to 60,000 years ago, early humans left Africa. They ran into Neanderthal, and I don't mean saw them across a valley and kept walking, I mean interbred with them, repeatedly, across multiple waves, in multiple regions. Neanderthals had one massive advantage. They'd already been living in Eurasia for 400,000 years. 400,000 years of getting hit by every regional pathogen, every local virus, every nasty little bug specific to that part of the world. Their immune systems had already fought that war and figured out the counters. So when humans and Neanderthals had children together, some of those kids inherited Neanderthal immune genes. And those genes turned out to be so useful that natural selection grabbed on and never let go. There's a cluster of genes called OAS1, OAS2, and OAS3. Their entire job is antiviral defense. A virus infects a cell. These genes trigger an enzyme that shreds viral genetic material before it can make more virus. This exact Neanderthal-derived version shows up in about 30% of people with European and South Asian ancestry today, around 20% in East Asian and Native American population. Let that sink in. Right now, in a huge chunk of the human population, there's a piece of Neanderthal biology, tens of thousands of years old, still actively fighting off viral infections. You didn't get this from a lab. You got it from your ancestors literally interbreeding their way into a better immune system. And it doesn't stop there. There's another gene, STAT2, involved in coordinating the immune response. It also traces back to Neanderthal ancestry in a huge portion of non-African populations today. Scientists have a theory for this, sometimes called the poison antidote idea. Certain dangerous viruses were passed between Neanderthals and early humans during this interbreeding, but along with the danger came the defense, the poison and the cure arriving together, tangled in the same strand of DNA. Now here's your pattern interrupt, because this gets crazier. Fast forward to 2020. COVID-19 sweeps the planet. Scientists studying why some people got catastrophically ill, while others barely noticed a cold, started digging into genetics. Guess what showed up? That exact same Neanderthal-derived version of OAS1, linked to a lower risk of severe COVID-19 and death. A defense system built tens of thousands of years ago against threats nobody today can even name, was still protecting people during one of the biggest pandemics of the modern era. Your ancient hookup with a Neanderthal might have quietly helped keep you alive. During a pandemic that happened, 5 years ago? Try explaining that one at a dinner party. But don't get too romantic about your Neanderthal ancestors. Here's the twist inside the twist. Not every piece of Neanderthal DNA was a gift. Researchers also found a different region on chromosome 3, also from Neanderthal, linked to a much higher risk of severe COVID-19 and hospitalization. So the same interbreeding event that handed some of your ancestors a shield handed others a landmine. Evolution isn't a benevolent designer optimizing you for happiness. It's an accountant. It only cares whether the math works out on average across a population over generations. Some individuals get the great trade, some get the bad. Nobody signs a consent form. Which brings us to the second event that literally rewired what it means to be human. This one didn't involve a virus at all, but it teaches you exactly how this whole brutal system works. The Black Death. Yes, technically a bacterium, not a virus. But stay with me. The mechanism is identical, and it's the clearest, best documented example we have of a pandemic sculpting the human genome in real time. In about 4 years in the 14th century, this single pandemic killed somewhere between 30 and 50% of the population across huge parts of Europe, the Middle East, North Africa. Not over a lifetime. In 4 years. Imagine losing every other person you've ever met. In the time it takes to finish a college degree, scientists eventually got access to something incredible. DNA extracted from the teeth of people buried before, during, and after the Black Death. From mass graves in London, cemeteries across Denmark, they compared the genomes of who died and who survived. One gene lit up above everything else. ERAP2. Its job is helping immune cells recognize invading pathogens and flag them for attack. People with 2 copies of the protective version were roughly 40% more likely to survive the plague. 40%. In a mass extinction event, that's one of the strongest, fastest bursts of natural selection ever measured directly in humans. Here's your reveal moment, because this is where the story stops being simple. That same protective gene, the one that helped your ancestors survive the deadliest pandemic in recorded history, is today linked to a higher risk of autoimmune diseases. Crohn's disease, rheumatoid arthritis. The exact same trait that once saved your bloodline from annihilation is now in a world without medieval plague quietly working against some of you. Evolution didn't build you for comfort in the 21st century. It built you to survive the specific hell your ancestors were actually living through. You're running software optimized for a completely different operating environment, and some of the side effects are still installed. Here's the thing people miss about events like the Black Death. They don't just select genes. They collapse populations down to a much smaller pool of survivors. And that pool becomes the starting point for everyone who comes after. Geneticists call this a bottleneck. Exactly what it sounds like. A huge, diverse population squeezed down through a narrow opening. Only a fraction makes it to the other side. Whatever genetic variety existed only in the people who didn't survive, gone. Permanently. So every pandemic in history wasn't just a horror story. It was also, in the coldest possible sense, an editing process, quietly deciding which genetic variants would even exist to be inherited by anyone born after. You didn't just inherit surviving genes. You inherited the only genes left standing. And the Black Death wasn't even the first time this happened. Centuries earlier, in the 6th century, an outbreak now called the Justinian Plague tore through the Byzantine Empire. Same bacteria, Yersinia pestis, different era. Some historians estimate it killed a quarter of the population in the eastern Mediterranean world, maybe more. It weakened empire, shifted the balance of power for generations, and it left behind the exact same kind of invisible fingerprint. A population that had just been through a brutal filter, passing down whatever genetic advantages helped people survive. 2 pandemics, 800 years apart, same pathogen, same grim math, same silent editing of the human genome, running quietly underneath the history books. Now you might be thinking, okay, so ancient humans had these secret genetic weapons. So why did entire populations sometimes get obliterated by disease? This is one of the most important parts of the whole story, because it flips the narrative on its head. When Europeans arrived in the Americas, they brought smallpox, measles, and other diseases indigenous populations had never encountered. The result wasn't just bad. In many regions, it was apocalyptic. Mortality estimates in some communities as high as 80 or 90%. Why such a brutal difference compared to Europe, where these diseases, while devastating, didn't wipe out entire continent? Because of exactly everything we just talked about. Europe, Asia, and Africa had spent thousands of years in constant contact, trading goods, trading languages, and unfortunately, trading pathogens. Every outbreak that swept through acted like the Black Death did to ERAP2, brutally selecting who lived and who died, quietly editing the gene pool toward resistance. Generation after generation of exposure meant generation after generation of selection. Populations in the Americas, isolated by oceans for thousands of years, had never been through that gauntlet. Their immune systems weren't weaker. Nobody's immune system is generically weak. They just hadn't been handed the specific cheat codes that only get written after repeated, brutal, population-scale exposure. Immunity, on a species level, isn't something you're born with in the abstract. It's something your ancestors had to earn, one horrific outbreak at a time, and the price of earning it was almost always mass death. So let's talk about what earning it looked like day to day. Because it wasn't just genetics quietly working in the background, ancient humans also survived through pure behavior. Instincts you still carry today, whether you've noticed or not. Ever wonder why certain bodily fluids or rotting things trigger such an intense immediate gag reflex. That's not random. That's your brain running an ancient threat detection algorithm, avoiding things that historically correlated with disease. People who felt disgust around the sick, the dead, the decaying were less likely to catch whatever killed them, and more likely to pass that aversion down. You didn't need to know what a pathogen was to avoid one. You just needed to feel like something was wrong and get away from it. That queasy feeling in your stomach right now? Same system, same ancestors, still running, and it wasn't only individual instinct, it was culture too, quietly doing the same job across entire society. Almost every ancient civilization independently developed rituals around death and illness that functioned as disease control, whether or not anyone realized it at the time. Burial practices that moved bodies away from living spaces fast. Isolation huts on the edges of villages. Rules about which foods to avoid during certain seasons or after certain illnesses. None of these societies had a word for pathogen, but they had thousands of years of watching what happened when they ignored the pattern, and thousands of years of watching what happened when they followed it. The ones who followed it tended to still be around, to pass the tradition on. The ones who didn't, quietly, weren't. And if you want proof this arms race never actually stopped, look at 1918. The influenza pandemic that year killed somewhere between 50 and 100 million people worldwide, more than both world wars combined, in barely more than a year. This didn't happen in some remote, undocumented past. It happened to your great-great-grandparents, or close enough, within living memory of people whose grandchildren are alive today. And it followed the exact same brutal logic as everything before it. Dense populations, close contact, a virus exploiting both, a death toll that quietly, invisibly, nudged the surviving human gene pool in one direction rather than another. Exactly the way the Black Death did. Exactly the way smallpox did. Exactly the way it's been happening since the first city was ever built. The pattern didn't end when history started being written down. It just started leaving better records. And this is where I want you to really sit with something, because it's easy to hear all this as an interesting biology lecture and completely miss how insane it actually is. Every single person alive today descends from an unbroken chain of ancestors who survived the Black Death, or dodged smallpox, or made it through some regional epidemic we don't even have a name for anymore, because it happened before anyone was writing things down. Every link in that chain had to survive. Not most links, every single one. One weak link anywhere in tens of thousands of years and you simply wouldn't exist. You're not just descended from survivors, you're descended from an unbroken, uninterrupted streak of stretching back further than agriculture, further than language, further than fire, and the tools that got them through weren't glamorous. It wasn't bravery. It wasn't intelligence, at least not directly. It was fever, cranking the internal temperature up like an eviction notice for invaders. It was disgust, an emotion nudging people away from danger they couldn't even explain. It was interferon, quietly shredding viral genetic material inside cells nobody in that era even knew existed. It was borrowed weapon, genetic material picked up from an entirely different species of human that went extinct tens of thousands of years ago, still running its antivirus software in roughly a third of the people walking around today. And it was raw, empirical trial and error, 40-day waits on ships, scabs ground into powder, tested on human lives, long before anyone could explain why any of it worked. Think about what that actually means for a second. Every scar on the human genome, every one of these gene variants we've talked about, is a tombstone with the names sanded off. Somewhere behind ERAP2 are the people who didn't have it. Somewhere behind the OAS cluster are the humans who never got that Neanderthal handshake. We don't know their name. We don't know their story. History doesn't remember the losers of a pandemic, only the fact that a pandemic happened. But their absence is exactly why the rest of us look the way we do, biologically speaking. Every gene you carry that helps you survive infection is, in a very real sense, the last one standing in a competition none of us signed up for. So here's where we land. Back at that camp, that cough, that invisible enemy nobody could see or name. Ancient humans didn't survive deadly viruses because they were tougher than us, or luckier than us, or somehow more resilient, in some vague, undefinable way. They survived because evolution had been running the most brutal debugging process imaginable for hundreds of thousands of years, killing off every version of the human immune system that couldn't handle what was coming, keeping only the versions that could, while the humans themselves layered on top of it every scrap of hard-won, unexplained wisdom they could scrape together. You are the final build, the one that made it through every single patch, biological and behavioral both. Every time you don't die from a virus that would have killed someone 1,000 generations ago, some tiny piece of that ancient war is still being fought, and won, inside, silent, automatically, without you ever knowing the battle happened at all.